This conference will now be recorded.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Michelle Briggs. I'm the Chief Park Ranger at the Soo Locks, and I studied Great Lakes Maritime History when I was at Western Michigan University getting my bachelor's and master's degrees. I've worked at the Soo Locks since 2009, and regarding some of the images that I'm going to have in this program, and there are a lot of them, I Googled some fair use images, but most of the photos, especially before the MacArthur lock construction, are from the Sioux Area Office glass plate negative collection. That's more than 1,700 images that are available online at the National Archives and at the Clark Historical Library. I'll share the links at the end of the program in case you want to explore some of those photo collections yourself. The Soo Locks are one of less than 3,000 National Historic Landmarks in the country, and we take great care to protect the historic fabric of our installation. Everything from light poles to trash cans and roof lines has to be reviewed and approved by the National Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Office before we can make any changes. I'll point out before I get started that the title you see up in the upper corner there is not a typo. There is no apostrophe in St. Mary's River the way that it is spelt properly. And technically, the river is not a river, but it's a strait. It's a 75-mile long series of lakes and connecting waterways that join Lake Huron to Lake Superior. Here you can see some of these lakes. There's Bud Lake, Hay Lake, Lake George, and then, of course, my house is over in this neighborhood. And then out here, Whiskey Bay near Brimley, and then heading out into Whitefish Bay. Lake Superior is 602 feet above sea level, give or take, and Lake Huron is about 580 feet above sea level. So through the course of the river, it's dropping about 22 feet. At Sault Ste. Marie, it drops 20 feet in about 3/4 of a mile. And that's the rapids that you see right here, photographed from the hydropower plant. Despite the rapids in the river, this river has always been a critical link to the Native American trade networks and the European trade networks that came later. The rapids were also a central part of life for the Ojibwe people that lived here. They would encamp on the shores of the river and harvest the whitefish. They would come by the thousands to do that. And I'd like to make a little note here. Here you see them doing some of this whitefish harvesting. In history, we tend to look at different eras as distinct things that begin and end at specific points. And unfortunately, our history textbooks kind of treat it the same way. And most students learn about Native Americans in the fall, and then that's it for the rest of the season. And I just want to note that the Ojibwe people never left this region. And although they may not encamp on the shores of the river anymore, they remain an important part of our community and a vital part of our economy as well. And although not singled out in the images in the rest of the program, it is highly likely that they are among the workforce building all of the locks and maintaining them as they still are today. And I'm going to point out, this is if any experts are out there can guess the age of this photo, there's a couple clues. We've got the railroad bridge there and the fish hatchery here still in the rapids. So when the European explorers, I should say not settlers, the explorers arrived, they reported that the rapids could be heard from 4 miles away. And rather than adopting the name Bawading, which is the Ojibwe word for this area, they renamed the area Sault Ste. Marie. Here you see the French and its more literal English translation. Sioux is an archaic French word, which is roughly for jumping, dropping, or rapids or falls. And I will also say that having the name Sault Ste. Marie spelt this way is a real nightmare when you have to call a power utility company and you get an automated message and you have to keep saying the name of your town. This is a low water photo from 2010 when we were having some low water levels, and it shows the bedrock just below the surface of the water. And this is what made it impossible to navigate even with loaded canoes. At the height of the fur trade, just after the American Revolution, the Northwest Fur Company built the first lock on the north shore of the Canadian River, or I'm sorry, of the St. Mary's River. And so this is the Canadian lock, the very first Canadian lock. It was about 40 feet long. It only had a drop of about 9 feet, and they could take a loaded Montreal canoe through it. Unfortunately for the lock, in 1814, a party of American soldiers made their way to the Soo and destroyed it. There's very little said about this event other than that it happened. I've never seen a drawing or a depiction of it happening, but I can imagine it was probably a pretty small band of soldiers about like this one. From that time on, everything had to be carried around the rapids. This is an operation that took place on Portage Avenue, portage, of course, being an old French word for carry. And that meant pretty much everything had to be carried, including the first steamship to be launched on Lake Superior. This boat, the Independence, was built in Chicago, and when it got up to the base of the rapids, it was hauled out of the water and pulled up Portage Avenue. This was an operation that took 7 weeks in 1845. And in 1854, it blew up just west of the locks. A newspaper account said that the cargo and the ship were reduced to atoms. Later on, someone went and salvaged the propeller. You see this propeller right there. And this is now in our park. You can go visit and get your picture taken with it if you want. So anyway, portaging cargoes is a regular and thriving business in Sault Ste. Marie. They installed this strap railway down Portage Avenue, being pulled by ox and horses. There were warehouses at each end, so boats would come up to those piers at each end of the rapids. They would unload. Their cargoes would be put into a warehouse, eventually transported down 3/4 of a mile to the other pier at the lower end or upper end, depending which the direction the cargo is going. And they would be reloaded. This was pretty much a thriving business for the citizens of Sault Ste. Marie. There was quite a little economy based on it. In 1838, canal and lock system were approved by Congress and for the state of Michigan to build. Ironically, considering that the Army runs the locks now, the Army is the one that stopped this project in 1839. In May, when a work party arrived to get started, they were met by 30 armed soldiers who broke up the work project because the project was going to interfere with a mill race they had for a mill on the fort. There was, due to slow travel and communication, by the time this finally got worked out and the War Department approved the project several months later, the person who was overseeing the project lost interest and moved on. The project remained controversial through the years. Locals, of course, objected to it, and Henry Clay had this to say about it on the Senate floor in 1840. I don't know if we're exactly as remote as the moon. Maybe we're a little out there, but that seems a little harsh. Luckily, future President Millard Fillmore felt a little differently about it, was a little more inclined to see the project through. He was president in 1850, and the project got moving. In 1853, they're breaking ground and the work really began. The first lock was, as I mentioned, built by the state of Michigan, and it was largely financed through a land grant. So the federal government gave the state 750,000 acres of public land to sell at a profit to pay for the project. For reference, this is an area of land about as big as Yosemite National Park. Work was finished within 2 years, and the lock opened in 1855. It was the largest shipping lock in North America when it opened, and it's a tandem lock. So there are 2 lock chambers. There's a lower lock chamber and an upper lock chamber. Each one had a lift of 9 to 10 feet, and so a boat would go through both, kind of like flight locks that they have on the Welland Canal now, only the Welland Canal ones are a little more exciting. So here's what's happening in 1855. And I'll point out the Civil War hasn't started yet. The Panama Canal doesn't exist yet. And one of the things that would eventually have a pretty big impact on the Soo Locks and the Great Lakes Industrial Revolution is, of course, this Bessemer process of steel making. The first Bessemer steel mill in the U.S. was actually opened in Wyandotte, Michigan. Another big 1855 event, the 91-foot-long Brigantine Columbia on August 17, 1855, carried the first load of iron ore through the state lock. Ironically, the largest cargo by volume was merchandise, so like packaged goods that year. followed by copper. There was only 1,400 tons of iron ore that passed through the locks the first year. If you take a look at this graph, you can see, though, how quickly iron ore took over as the dominant cargo. Copper remained pretty flat, and there were some fluctuations in growth in coal and merchandise, but iron ore quickly became king. And here you can see the ratio of iron ore to other cargoes as it grew. And this is still pretty much the case today. Our main cargo, by and large, is iron ore. The lock was instantly busy, and it remained so. From the very beginning, you can see it went from 193 passages the very first year to over 3,500 passages by 1880. The total tonnage rose at pretty much the same rate. There was less than 2,000 tons the first year of the lock operated, and they were well over 1 million by 1880. And by 1876, that was when the lock first hit 1 million tons of cargo passed. It was operating at full capacity, and it was not enough. Boats had to wait for a long time to returns at the lock. And another problem was that the shipping industry was growing, literally growing. They were building boats that had drafts that were too deep for the chamber, which was only 12 feet deep. And they were starting to build boats that were pushing the limits of the size of the chamber as well. This is one of those vessels. It launched in 1855. This is the Mississippi. It was a 327-foot long boat. I mentioned the chamber is 350 feet, but you have to have some room to be able to open those gates inwards. So that eats up some of your chamber space. So it's debatable if this boat could have even fit into the lock. So Michigan now has, by 1880, an aging lock. It's in almost constant use during its season, roughly April through December, and it can't keep up with the demand for traffic. And it's not deep enough for the newer vessels. And Michigan, unfortunately, was not in a position to build a new lock. And I'm going to take a minute and point out this veranda here on one of their office buildings. That was actually added for visitors to keep them out of the way because they would want to come and watch the boats locking through, even in 1855. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers took on building a new lock just south of the original state lock. It's basically where the MacArthur lock is today if you've been to the Soo Locks. The excavation began in 1873, and this photo, taken 3 years later, shows the laying of the first stone. So that's right over here. You've got a nice little crowd of people come to watch. And this stone, by the way, is in the park. So if you visit the Soo Locks, you can actually go and see this first stone for the Weitzel lock. We only have a few construction photos of the Weitzel lock. This one taken a year after laying that stone so this picture is 1877. You can see that it's being made with cut stone blocks, and you can kind of start to see this chamber starting to take shape. The Weitzel lock, 515 feet long, 80 feet wide, 17 feet deep. When it opened in 1881, Michigan got completely out of the Soo Lock business, and the entire facility was turned over to the federal government, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has operated and managed it ever since. We don't have any pictures of the lock opening, but this is a pretty nice one from 1891 showing it in use. And the little landmark we always use if we're looking upstream or downstream is that railroad bridge up there at the upper end. And I will also point out there's no state lock here anymore. That's now a construction site by 1891. The Weitzel lock was originally called the Lock of 1881. In 1890 and 1891, it was renamed in honor of this gentleman, Lieutenant Colonel Godfrey Weitzel, who was the district engineer pretty much for the duration of the construction of that project. Here you see a few more events. Billy the Kid is making a bit of a splash. You'll notice we had 3 presidents in 1881. Rutherford B. Hayes finished his term, and James A. Garfield was elected, then assassinated, and Chester Arthur had to take over. And I also point out this thumb fire in Michigan burnt 1 million acres in less than a day, and that disaster would be the first activity that the relief effort of the American Red Cross would undertake. So back to the lock. There's not many construction photos, as I mentioned, but we have a nice collection of repair photos. And this one from 1890 shows an important innovation in this lock. This lock, I also point out, has a wooden floor. This is a wooden floor, and it has wooden gates in its construction, but it also has these openings on the lock floor, and these are culverts that are used to fill the lock. This was the first lock built on site that filled and emptied this way. It cuts down on turbulence as opposed to opening sluices in the gates like they did on the state lock. And every lock that we have built on site since then has used a variation of this system of filling and emptying. This is one of my favorite photos. What amazes me are these little boys. There are little boys down here in the lock. This is a big opening water flowing through it. And these kids are just running around down here barefoot. I don't know how they got in and out. I presume there must have been a really tall ladder. This is about a 40-foot drop from the surface to the lock floor. And also look at all these people on the edges. No rails. They're all just standing around to watch. It's amazing. And I will also point out this lock is shut down. It's 1890. It's August 2nd. That means that there is no traffic passing through the locks because there are no locks. The state lock is now a construction site, and there are no locks on the Canadian side of the river. And despite being shut down, this lock set a new record that year. It moved over 9 million tons of cargo in 10,577 passages. That's an average of 46 passages a day during its operating season. And now it's shut down for several days to make a repair. The first year it opened, the Weitzel moved 1.5 million tons of cargo. And by 1892, the year of this photo, it moved over 11 million tons of freight and had over 26,000 passengers moved through the lock. Here you can see 2 whalebacks that are going through. This is a very distinct Great Lakes vessel style. They made about 40 of them that somehow didn't really catch on beyond the turn of the century. This is a Samuel Mather towing barge 10. The state lock, I mentioned, finished operating in 1888, and by 1889 they were tearing it out. So they're excavating to build the new lock, and this is the very first photo we have in the series of photos of the Poe lock construction. And this is before the demolition of the state lock. So you can kind of see its walls here, and you can see the Weitzel over here. It's about in that lock at the time the photo was taken. And this is one of the last photos of the chamber of the state lock. So here you see the recesses for its gates, and this is one of its chambers. And actually I have no reason for this other than I love that dog. He's one of several dogs that show up in the construction photos. And I have to say I wish we had a Soo Locks dog now. And back to regular history. This photo, looking upstream, shows what the work they had done by 1890. The state lock is gone completely, and I wanted you to notice how big of a hole they have to make. This lock's only going to be about 100 feet wide, but they have to make a much, much bigger hole. Oops. The other thing I wanted to point out with this, look at all these masts, and look at the date of this photo. That repair photo we looked at was August 2nd, 1890. This is July 31st, 1890. So this is before the lock went down. And look at all those masts that are waiting for passage. By 1891 in September, they were ready to start actual construction. And so a crowd assembled to be present for the laying of the first stone. And I'll point out, this is quite a crowd. There's all these ladies down here. And this lady brought her baby, and there's a little girl there. And look at this rickety ladder they had to go up and down to get to the lock floor. Just crazy to me. This lock used a mix of steam and horsepower. And one thing I love this photo here. We could never reproduce this photo. Our safety officer would lose his mind. These guys are on the cranes. There's another guy sitting way up here on the boom. And no way we could redo this. Hard hats weren't even a thing in 1892. And like the Weitzel and state locks, this lock was stone masonry construction. And the area now known as Brady Park was the site of Fort Brady at that time, and they had a pier here for loading and unloading vessels, and they have stiff leg cranes here for unloading vessels, and then there's a mobile crane here for moving stone within the work area. And here you see one of the stiff legs unloading the quarried stone from one of the barges. And there was a planer in Fort Brady, which they used to finish the stone. And then once the stone was finished, they had to load it back onto barges to take it to the work site because, of course, the work site is north of the Weitzel Lock, so it's essentially an island. And once on site, they use these mobile cranes to set the blocks in place. Here they're just finishing up one of the miter walls, and everybody came along to pose. And one of the things I think is kind of interesting too is just the sheer amount of work that went into these auxiliary items for construction. So you have to build this span, this bridge practically, to run your mobile cranes on. They've had to build a little roadway going up with a rail line. And then, of course, they have all these stiff leg cranes for unloading the barges that are bringing materials. Once the chamber monolith was constructed, that's the lock walls, the outer structure of the lock. There was still a lot to be done. These guys are testing bolts. This is a wooden floor, just like the Weitzel lock, so it's all going to be bolted down. And I will also mention most of the negatives in the glass plate collection are pictures of big things and big structures and lots and lots of documenting of machines and parts and rock. These are some of my favorite photos that actually show the guys working and the hard work that went into it, and you can really see the effort they're putting into it. And any of you who follow our Facebook page and the winter work images will probably know that I'm kind of biased because these are the kind of photos I also like to take. And we're still a year from opening the lock. This photo in May 1895. They're assembling the gates. The gates are assembled in place. This was the first lock on the river to be built with steel gates. It took over 2.5 tons to build the gates for this lock. And by January 1896, we're getting closer to ready to open. And I think this one's kind of remarkable because there's really not any snow to speak of. This is January, and these guys are not wearing coats. And, you know, people are pretty tough in the Soo, but we're not quite that tough. So it must have been unseasonably warm weather. And I also point out the administration building here. Again, one of our landmarks that we use when we're looking downstream. You look for the admin building downstream, you look for the railroad bridge upstream. It doesn't have its distinctive steeply peaked roof or its tower, but it's starting to take shape here at the lower end of the lock. Here you see it nearly done. This is I like this photo a lot too because again we've got these guys up here, no safety equipment, no safety gear, just working up there. That's probably about 5 to 6 stories high. And then when you zoom into this picture, there's a little girl standing there. There's no rail. This building is still a construction zone, so it's not like her mom is inside working nearby. There's just this little girl here by herself standing there. Another one of my favorites because we get to actually see the guys doing the work. And I'll point out these guys are not using any fall protection gear. A couple of them are hanging onto the rope, but they're just up there. It seems amazing. This is a picture of the interior of our administration building being finished. They've got some wood down to protect the tile mosaic floor. If any of you have been here on Engineers Day, you will know that you can go in this building and it is absolutely gorgeous and very much recognizable from what you see in this image. On August 3rd, 1896, the Poe Lock officially opens. The U.S. Hancock, U.S. Antelope, and U.S. Revenue Cutter Andrew Jackson were the very first vessels. We're looking at this. We're looking from the downbound and upbound because there's a railroad bridge. And I want to also point out how close the rapids are to this original Poe Lock, which is in the location where today's current Poe Lock is. We have 2 more locks and a hydropower plant out here. So it's kind of amazing how the river has changed and modified as we have built new locks. So the name of the Poe lock, I will confess, I get a lot of strange looks when I'm talking to the public and talking about the Poe lock. It's actually named for this gentleman, General Orlando M. Poe. He was a Civil War general, and he served twice as the Detroit District Commander. He oversaw the design of a very distinctive Great Lakes lighthouse style with the large conical towers, attached dwelling, kind of like the Ensemble Light or Spectacle Reef Light. And he was overseeing the construction of the Poe lock, of course. He had come up for an inspection of the work site in late 1895, and he was injured and died from his injuries about a month afterwards. And he was honored with the name of the lock. He also has a reef named after him off the coast of Sheboygan. It's the Poe Reef, and then there's a Poe Reef lighthouse on top of that as well. So 1896, phones are a thing, electrical power is catching on, and we already have a hydropower plant in the rapids at Sault Ste. Marie. And George Burns is born. Backtracking just a little bit to 1870, I want to give a very brief history of the Canadian lock. When the state lock was in operation, this vessel, the Chicora, wanted to go through the locks on its way to Western Canada. And this vessel had served as a blockade runner during the Civil War. Canada, of course, is still at that time technically England. And the U.S. military and the U.S. government did not want to allow this vessel to go through, probably partly based on its history and the fact that it was loaded with soldiers and military supplies. They ended up forcing the boat to dock, unload. They had to portage all the soldiers and all their equipment around the rapids. They held this boat up at the dock for about 2 months before they would clear it to go through. And this ended up causing the Canadian government to question its dependence on a U.S. lock. It took a while, like any big government project, but in the 1880s, 1889, they started constructing a lock on the Canadian side of the river. And it went on pretty much on pace with the construction of the Poe lock. The Canadian lock opened in 1895, so this photo was taken a year before that. And at the time when it opened, at 899 feet long, it was the longest navigation lock in the world, and it was the first one powered by electricity. Here we see a picture from the 1909 lock accident, which was pretty exciting to be there, I presume. The lock was at high pool. There was a passenger vessel, the Assiniboina, in the lock, secured to the wall. The Crescent City was a freighter loaded with iron ore, was coming into the lock, so the water is up 21 feet higher than what you see here. Below the lock, the freighter Perry G. Walker rammed the gates and caused a breach, which ended up forcing these gates open. The upper gates, you'll recall, are open because the other boat was coming in. And basically, it sent a wall of water 20 feet high out of the lock. The two vessels came screaming out at about 40 miles an hour, and it tore these gates off their anchorages. This one is, completely flat, the reverse direction it's supposed to go. Here's a view of the free flow at the upper end of the lock. I use this picture a lot when I'm explaining to people why we don't just open the gates and let the boats shoot through. They quite literally would shoot through. They were able to use their emergency swing dam. So this is kind of like a swing bridge, but it swings across the lock. They drop these shutters down or wickets down, and then they lower the shutters within the wickets. And within 3 hours, they had the water under control enough to be able to operate auxiliary gates and start making repairs. If you go to Sault, Canada, this bridge is still there. It's the last one in the world, and you can drive all the way out to it. They have some nice interpretation of it. They test this bridge every year, and it is still a critical piece of their safety equipment. The original lock that opened in 1895 ended up closing in 1987 when part of the lock started to collapse, the wall collapsed. And they ended up building a smaller lock within the original chamber. The new one, as you'll see, is only 9 feet deep, so it's not able to lock any cargo vessels, and it's also only 253 feet long. So back to the American Soo Locks. Traffic continued to increase, and even with 3 locks operating on the river, keeping up could be a struggle. Here we see the Superior City and the passenger vessel Northwest in the Po lock, and I'll point out they're tied up side by side. This lock was designed 100 feet wide, and it was specifically done that way to be able to do 2 vessels at a time. The Weitzel lock was also designed the same way, which is why it has this narrow gate and a wider chamber, so they could put vessels in side by side. Hit a wrong button, my apologies. The Superior City was the largest boat on the Great Lakes when it was built in 1898, and in 1920 it sank in Whitefish Bay and is now a protected shipwreck in that preserve. By 1907, work to build a longer, newer lock began. It started out with taking core samples. So they're getting core samples of the bedrock below the surface, and these samples are still stored and available if they're needed for study. This photo from February 1908 shows the preliminary excavation getting started. This seems a hard way to get going, and I'll point out these guys are using wooden-handled shovels that had to make for a really long day. They're using horses to haul these loaded carts away. And eventually, they did work their way up to steam shovels. And so you can see these steam shovels starting to do the excavation. And then you'll note the original tower on the administration building. Now we have more like an aircraft control tower up there, and it's actually where the dispatcher, the lockmaster, works from. But at the time it was built, this was more of a ventilation shaft, and it had this kind of ornate birdcage top to it. David Lock construction was also an island, but during the off-season, they installed these pontoon bridges to run locomotives over, which had to make it a lot easier to move things in and out. If you've watched any of my previous programs, you'll know that the things that make a lock work are hidden from view, and they're encased in the walls, and this gives us a really nice photo of those culverts starting to take place in the Davis lock. These are the forms that they'll be pouring around to make the culverts to fill the chamber with water. Up here we have a hydropower plant, and over here again the railroad bridge, so we can tell we're looking upstream. And I want to point out the channeled rock here. They had to cut through the bedrock to make the space to put the lock in. And here you can see a close-up of those culvert forms. Another nice picture of the guys working. And I'll point out one of our volunteers, it was a member of her family that owned the lumber mill that sold most of the lumber to make all of these forms. The Davis block was the first one built with poured concrete, and to do this efficiently, they installed a rock crusher and a cement mixer right on the site. And then here you see the forms for the miter wall set in place, getting ready for placing concrete. This is what we would call a sill now. This is the structure within the lock that the gates rest against. And here you can see the huge forms for the lock monolith walls. You'll notice these forms here are mobile. They're on rail tracks. So when they are finished pouring one, they can slide it down and start the next one. And they pour them in alternating sections. And here you can see how the walls flare out at the base and how at the thick parts, it's massive. I have an engineering-minded son who likes Fermi questions, so kind of where you figure out an impossible thing. And he had figured out that the concrete used to build this lock is enough to pave from Sault Ste. Marie to the Mackinac Bridge. And continuing to highlight some of the hidden parts of the lock, this is the discharge pipe. Apparently they were incredibly proud of it, the East Jersey Pipe Company, and there's a horse of the sledge dragging it across to get it into place. And I will let you know, we actually still use this discharge pipe when we're dewatering the lock. And here you can see the butterfly valves. They operate like this to let water in and out of the culverts. And in winter 1914, crews are assembling the lower gates. Again, no fall protection. And here you see these 2 guys up in the gate. I hope there was a little opening here they were crawling in and out of, but otherwise I do not see how they got in there. And here you see the finished gates. This is one of my favorite photos, and this one is extremely popular. It was used in the Clark exhibit they did a few years ago about the Soo Locks. And with these guys here, you really kind of see the scale of this project. In October 1914, the lock opens. You see a huge crowd coming to watch. This lock was named for Colonel Charles E.L.B. Davis. He was the Detroit District Engineer from 1914 to 1908. I've tried to find out more about him, but I have been unable to. And there has to be a story there. Shortly after leaving the Detroit District, he eventually made it to General and retired the day after he was raised to the level of a general. I suspect there has to be a story. I can't imagine you make general and decide you've had enough. So here's what's going on in the rest of the world in 1914. We have the 5-hour workday. I wish a 5-hour workday. We have the $5 a day wage for 8 hours. And World War I is just getting started. Another 1914 event, which would make a kink in the lock plans, was the launching of the W. Grant Morden. It's 625 feet long. It's the longest boat on the Great Lakes at the time until 1926. The Davis lock was 1,350 feet long, so that it could lock 3 boats at a time. Well, once you start getting these boats over 600 feet long, that is no longer an option. And another thing's happening. They're constructing a new lock. So right here, you see these are the people on the walls. Behind them is another construction zone. And we are starting to build the Sabin lock. Work began the year before in 1913. And here a photographer caught a blast of 4,650 pounds of dynamite getting started on that big hole. The Sabin's an exact twin of the Davis, so I'm going to go through this a little faster. I just wanted to point out here the channeled rock and these huge blocks of rock that have to be lifted out and taken out of the pit, and the beautiful striations. This is going to be that red and white sandstone that we have up here. And then you'll see again there's the railroads all up and down here for moving materials, and they have shifted the concrete operations over here to this new site. If you've watched the winter work program, you know that ice is a thing here. It's April in this photo when the rest of the world's watching for daffodils. We are hooking up huge blocks of ice to a crane and moving them out of the way so that we can get to work. This is 3 years before the lock opens. You start to see the monolith taking place. We're looking downstream because there's the administration building. And one thing that amazes me, this is December. You see all the snow. I presume there's icy surfaces. There's a guy just standing here on the edge. I don't think that I could do that. A few years later, they're getting ready to backfill that back side. You'll notice how this flares out, and they're going to backfill all of this in. The guys are standing here watching. And we're assembling the gates. And some of the work and the way they do these things to me is just absolutely terrifying. This guy's just hanging on by one hand. I wouldn't be able to do a thing. I'd be hanging on with both arms and legs. This guy's kind of like leaning on the other one, big old smile for the camera. Here in 1919, lock's almost finished. They're looking upbound. You can see that gate they were building is now in its recess. Up here is the Bascule Bridge. When this was set in place in 1913, it was the largest bascule bridge in the world. That bridge is still at the site, still operational, still crosses that canal. And here you see the railroad again. That's how we know we're looking upstream. 6 years after that first blast of dynamite, they're ready to fill the lock. This lock had bypass valves in its forebay at the upper end. So there's an opening over on this side that's letting the water from upstream come through here and then start filling the lock. The boat in the Davis lock next door to it there is the DM Philbin. It's a 524-foot Duluth steamship company, and it actually sailed till 1980. A week after filling the lock, they had the official opening. This one was September 18th, so it was mid-September. And you'll notice there's not many people there. It makes me wonder if it was an unseasonably cold day. It gets cold in the Soo, but usually mid-September we still have some pretty nice weather. And all these people are wearing coats when I'm able to zoom in on them. And then we caught one of the photographers getting his shot there. The first freighter going through right there is the William Livingstone. And it's a 532-foot boat. The lock is named for Louis Sabin. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of him, but I do have a picture of the boat, or the book he wrote. He wrote the book on cement and concrete, and I suppose having built the first 2 locks on site ever made with poured concrete, he probably was an expert. He was a Michigan native and a civil engineer. He worked for the Detroit district for 35 years, and 19 of those he was the superintendent at the Soo Locks. And he's actually credited with designing the Davis and Sabin locks. So one thing to mention here, in the course of the construction of this lock from start to finish, World War I has happened and ended. And through that whole war, they were building a lock here in Sault Ste. Marie. After 1919, the Soo had 4 locks in operation. So we have 4 on the U.S. side, and then there's 1 in Canada, actually. And it was incredibly busy. You see here a backup of vessels waiting to go downstream. They've been through the lock. They're waiting to go downstream, but there's ice problems in the river. This is a view across the original Poe lock right here. And you have a vessel here, the William H. Wolfe, loaded with cars. One thing that's kind of neat to note is that used to be a pretty common way to ship cars west. Between 1937 and 1941, we had 140,695 cars locked through the Soo Locks. Tourists used to be able to go all over the facility. Here they're standing outside the Davis building where I have my office to watch the Percival Roberts going by. Tonnage had its ups and downs with the economy, but it was managed between the existing locks. The original Poe was occasionally taken out of service from time to time as there would be downturns, like from 1931 through 36. And there was not really a lot of serious talk about building any additional locks until January 1941, when tonnage started to increase as the war buildup was starting to happen. And a lot of the companies were wanting a deeper lock, the shipping companies, that is. And but there was no real momentum behind that project. Then Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and things changed dramatically in Sault Ste. Marie. Note the lack of tourists on the walls. When we zoom in, we see the first fences that have gone up to keep the public away. By November, the fences were taller and topped with barbed wire and guarded by soldiers. So this is 1939. Sentry booths had been installed. They're manned by soldiers. They have these pretty heavy-duty spotlights to keep an eye on what's happening. Even the piers between the locks are strung with barbed wire. They're illuminated, and they have sentry points, various spots along the way. In 1939, Fort Brady was at the top of the hill. It had relocated there in 1892, and it only had about 200 soldiers stationed there, but it quickly grew. A barrage balloon battalion was added, and thousands of soldiers to patrol, man sentry booths, and anti-aircraft stations, and operate these 5-foot searchlights. In October 41, Bascule Bridge the train bridge failed. It dropped a locomotive in the river along with a tender and 35 freight cars. The engineer, Hazen Willis, and the conductor, Dave Monroe, were trapped in the engine and killed. The brakemen and the firemen were able to swim clear. Sabotage was immediately suspected, and the military was on the scene and quickly determined that it was a mechanical failure. Meanwhile, the cars have been cleared in this photo, but the locomotive is still submerged and blocking the canal that leads to the Davis and Sabin locks, which, as you'll remember, are the largest and the deepest locks. But unfortunately, the only other locks available are shallow. They only have the Canadian, the Poe, and the Weitzel. The Canadian lock is only 18 feet deep. The Poe is 21 feet deep, and the Weitzel lock is only 17 feet deep and only 515 feet long. And unfortunately, boats longer than 600 feet are fairly common at this point. 4 days later, there were dozens of boats waiting, and they were able to remove the engine and open the canals. Two months later, the military actively ramped up even more after Pearl Harbor attack, and the U.S. entered the war. In 1942, a vital defense zone was set up with a radius that included most of Chippewa County, and then it was soon expanded to 150 miles around Sault Ste. Marie. Oops, I hit a wrong button. They also built radar bases in northern Canada to monitor any aircraft that might be coming over through Hudson Bay, so that might reach the locks. And they built airstrips at Rayco, Michigan, and Kinross, Michigan. The one at Kinross is now our local airport, and the one at Rayco has been incorporated into a winter driving testing facility. At the peak of military activity in the Sioux in 1943, there were 12,000 soldiers here. This is pretty amazing when you consider that the local population was only about 6,000 people. This photo shows them in a parade down Ashman Street for Army Day. In other World War II news, a new deeper lock is approved to replace the Weitzel lock. So they're going to build a new lock right here along the shoreline, replacing the Weitzel lock. This project was approved in March 1942, and by June 1942, the lock has been dewatered and excavation is well underway. This lock was built in lightning speed. It opens on July 11, 1943, only 13 months from the time of this photo. Part of the speed was probably due to meticulous planning and doing several things at once. For instance, the excavation of the chamber is already going on, but they're still finishing the cofferdams to create the dry workspace. We've looked at a lot of construction photos, so I'm going to not go into as much detail here, but I want to highlight some of the best ones I have in the little collection of photos I've scanned from our records room, and show how quickly the work progressed. And I have to say, I wonder how the people working in the admin building got there and what the noise must have been like with all of this going on right outside their windows. And again, now the workers have hard hats, but still no fall protection. And it's amazing how close this foundation and the lock structure is to the administration building. This one always kind of surprises me too, that they would be blasting with a boat so close. I'm not sure if this is in the Poe or the Davis lock. It looks awfully close, like it must be in the Poe, but I can't say for sure. The boat's the Fred L. Hewitt. It was built in 1908 and sailed until 1968 when it was scrapped. But right here is the blast going off with that boat right there in the lock. By August, they were building the forms. These aren't on rails like the Davis and Sabin ones. And there were lots of other things happening at the same time. Way up here at the upper end, you see where they're building the forms. Over here, they're still doing the excavation. 4 weeks later, they filled in some of the gaps in that monolith wall structure, and they're putting in blocks to do the next layer of the pier wall. We have a safety officer at the Soo Locks right now, and we have lots of first aid kits all around, but they had an actual field hospital for the men building this project. And I didn't zoom in on these, but these are some pretty great World War II espionage kind of warnings and some safety warnings. We have safety signs today too, but none of them are as colorful as these. Work went on year-round and around the clock on this lock. So they're working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This February photo shows them building the new nose pier. Every time you build a deeper or larger lock, it also means you have to alter the channels in the approach piers. Even concrete placement was happening year-round. So here they're building little shelters around the forms and heating them to keep it warm enough for the concrete to cure properly. And unfortunately, these forms sometimes caught on fire, and it would set the work back, and they'd have to remove the damaged concrete. And hopefully you can read this. These little signs were posted all over the place. It says, "Danger, watch for fires. Fires help the axes." And here's a snapshot of progress as of April 10th, 1943. Remember, this lock is going to open and pass its first boat in mid-July 1943. And also look at the barrage balloon over here. These were flown above the site. They had cables that hung down. They were actually all around Sault Ste. Marie. They had huge cables that hung down. And the idea was if someone tried to dive bomb the facility, they would get tangled up in those barrage balloons and they would be unable to accomplish their mission. The locals came to hate those. They were filled with hydrogen. They were highly flammable. They would explode. They would break loose. There was a shop downtown where one of these barrage balloons had broken loose and exploded and blew all the windows out of the shop. This is the same day. So here's the photo there, April 1943. This is what's happening at the lower end. Up here at the upper end, they're already building the lock gates. And again, lack of fall protection. This is about a 20 to 30 foot drop off this sill. And he's just standing there working with a tripping hazard right behind him. If that were me, I would definitely end up tripping over that box there. 2 weeks later, they're building the lower gates. The floor isn't poured yet, but they're also working on spare gates for the Davis and Sabin locks, which was considered a good insurance policy during World War II. In case there was an attack, they wanted a spare set of gates. This is the same day as building those lower gates. And here you can see that they're still pouring the floor in the forebay. And up to mid-May, remember the lock opens July 11th, forms for parts of the lock monolith are still being built and the concrete placed. This is the same day looking downstream. So here's those lock monolith forms that we saw from the other direction. And you can see all of the work still left to be done on the lock floor. By June 10th, they're finishing up the chamber floor. Here you can see the filling and emptying ports. They're working their way down. And the monolith is almost done. June 26th, the last load of concrete came. This is a kind of famous picture. I always like to imagine that maybe this is one of the secretaries who worked in the admin building, but who knows? And they're placing that last load of concrete. June 26th, 1943. 16 days before the lock is going to open. 4 days later, they're starting to fill the lock. So this is the water coming up through those ports in the floor to start filling the lock with water. And there's quite a little crowd here to watch. And July 11th, pretty much right on time, the Carl D. Bradley, the largest boat on the lakes at the time, is making the very first official lockage. You see there's a whole crowd, and I think there's a little band there on site to commemorate the day. And I will also confess that this is a colorized photo. This is a artificially colorized photo. It just looks so happy and cheery that I wanted to use that instead of the black and white. During the construction of this project, it was called the New First Lock, which I think is a really clever name. And it was very quickly named for General Douglas MacArthur. He began his career as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 1903. And I think we're pretty, I don't know, let's just say 1943. I did some cutting and pasting, my apologies. The other events are correct. So World War II is still going on with fighting in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Tonnages dipped slightly after the war and then rose again. Construction of a new, larger lock was approved in 1943, but not funded right away. After the MacArthur lock opened, use of the original Poe lock, which you see right here, declined and was eventually decommissioned in 1955. This is one of the very last photos of it before it was demolished to build a new, larger lock, 1,000 feet long and 100 feet wide and 32 feet deep. So I'll also point out that this is, I think, an April photo. And again, we've got a whole bunch of ice here. We still have winter when everyone else is done with it. On October 16th, they were finishing the cofferdams to start construction on this new 1,000-foot long lock. January 62, they're doing the excavation. They're working behind that original lock chamber right here. Here's a view from inside the chamber showing the remnants of the Poe lock. So there's the remnants of that original wall in February. They had to cut up the original gates. Those very first steel gates on the river had to be cut up into smaller pieces so that they could lift them out and complete the excavation. In March 26th, you can see it's a much bigger hole. And here you can see also the highway bridge is being assembled. So the highway bridge is a brand new construction that's going on at the same time. In June, they were taking huge core samples of the bedrock. And they do this to have a better understanding of what's below the lock surface and sometimes how much they're going to have to excavate to have a stable space for it. You can still see one of these core samples if you come to the park at the Soo Locks. We've got this out in the west end of the park. In September 1962, most of the excavation is finished and they're ready to proceed. Except they had to stop construction and flood the work site to redesign it for the 1,000-foot long, 105-foot wide boats that were in the locks for several Great Lakes fleets. I mentioned the original plan was to build a lock 1,000 feet long and 100 feet wide. Well, this boat right here is 1,000 feet long and 105 feet wide. In August 1964, they had finished redesigning the lock. The lock is now going to be 1,200 feet long and 110 feet, and they're going to start the pumps up right now in this little official restart so they can resume the construction of the new lock. Here they're building a new longer pier. I mentioned when we build a new lock, quite often we have to do the pier, and this is actually a pretty darn long pier. And I'll tell you, it gets even longer when it's really cold. A friend of mine, I won't name any names, is a deckhand and was let off here to walk his boat in, and he thought he dropped his wallet. And he sent me a message to see, can you find my wallet? So it was probably about 10 degrees out and windy, and I walked this entire length there and back looking for his wallet. And I get back to my office and I see a message from him that he had found it. It was in his other pants. Here's a nice aerial view, and you can see the kind of hole you have to make to build the lock. So this used to be the Poe lock, and now it is the construction zone. We can probably anticipate a mess like this in the future. They also have to build roads and ramps within so they can get materials in and out of the lock area. And I will point out too that this is also an island construction. And this one is actually happening between two active locks. So while they are working on this lock, there are boats going through on each side, going through the MacArthur lock and going through the Davis lock on the other side. And so all of that excavated material they have to take out has to be loaded into dump trucks, dumped into barges, and then taken away. February 1965, if they're setting up the mixing plant at the lower end. And this boat right here is the John W. Boardman. It's a cement carrier, and it is bringing materials. This is April, and this one makes me laugh. The caption says, "Second pour." So this was the second pour for the new construction. I wonder what happened that they missed the first pour. You can see it right here, but I wonder, did the camera fail or did somebody not tell the guy it was coming? But they got a picture of the second pour. September 66, I have to say, I don't know who the photographer was, but I am so thankful they took this picture and from this angle. I use this photo all the time to show people where the culverts are and basically what a cross section of the monolith looks like. This is the only picture I've ever seen of any of the lock monoliths that is so revealing. In May 1967, they're setting rebar for the laterals. The laterals are where the water comes in and out of the lock chamber through these little openings and these tunnels that connect to the culverts in the lock walls. Here you have an overhead view of the work that's going on. These parts right here are the forms where the rebar is, where the concrete is going to be poured. And then they're, of course, having to also build the little openings in there too as well to make the void when they pour the concrete. Here we have August 1967. The lock is getting awfully close to done. This is June 1967. And here you can see those laterals on the floor. Those are the openings that the water comes in and out of when they're raising or lowering the water levels. And I will also point out a little spot near and dear to my heart is the visitor center right here, which was a new construction during the Poe lock, and to facilitate visitors coming to learn more about the facility. Here they have done more work. They've taken out the crib dams over here, and they are using the lower guard gates and the stop logs to hold the water back while they finish the construction. By the end of August 1968, they start filling the lock. This one they do by lifting the logs. It's always an exciting thing when they lift the logs to re-water the lock. And I imagine this one must have been even more so since it really is the very first test of a newly constructed lock, is how it's going to behave when they start filling it with water. Then it had its second test, and this is October 30th, 1968. This is about a month and a half after yours truly was born. I like to say the lock is dates from 1968, so it can just be my age, but they like to give the official date when it opened. Its second test was locking the downbound Philip R. Clark with a load of iron ore. You can see all the white-hatted technicians and engineers on hand to see how this goes. And it's hard to believe, but after they locked the Clark through, the lock just sat. They did not use it anymore again until June. Its tonnage for the year of 1968 was 20,248 tons. So that's just that one passage of the Philip R. Clark. 9 months later, the lock does officially open, and it's the Philip R. Clark again. Coming upbound, you can see a huge crowd. The governor was there. Several congressmen were there to give speeches. And up here is one of the most honored guests, in my opinion. That's Captain Small. He was a deckhand on the first freighter to go through the original Poe lock in 1896. And he was an honorary captain. He was actually a captain in real life in his career, but he had retired. He came back, and he was the honorary captain of the Philip R. Clark going into the Poe lock for that first time. This lock is also named for General Orlando M. Poe. Here's what else is happening in 1969. In addition to the chief park ranger of the Soo Locks turning 1 year old. This is a little more familiar, and my favorite thing in the list is probably Scooby-Doo airing its first episode. The current Poe lock completed our current configuration with 4 locks in the US and a small lock in Canada. So here you see our MacArthur, Poe, Davis, Sabin, the power plant, the Rapids, and then the Canadian lock right there. Kurt Vonnegut wrote something to the effect that science fiction is about the past and history is about the future. And I think that there's some truth in that. We study the past to understand the present and plan for the future. The ups and downs still continue. We still track cargoes that go through the Soo Locks. Here you see the last 10 years. Weather, the economy, and things like infrastructure have a lot of impacts on that. When there's a rail shortage and they can't move the ore from the taconite mills to the docks, that affects what happens in the Soo Locks, as well as weather and changes in the demand for raw materials. We continue to set new records. The Indiana Harbor carried the largest load of iron ore on August 17th, 2009, so just last summer. She was loaded with 77,543 tons of iron ore. And I called this final section Living History because we are living through history and watching a familiar pattern play out with the approval of the new Soo Lock in 1986, which, we had to wait a while. Preliminary work starting in 2009, which was building these cofferdams at either end to get the Sabin lock ready for its removal. And then they did excavation work or dredging work in the lower approach canal. And the project starting in earnest just this year with work on the upper approach. So they are now dredging the canal up here and the approaches to get it to the new project depth of 30 feet. And we're anticipating an official opening again of a new lock by 2030 or sooner. And right there are the links to the glass plate negatives. I will post those in the chat in a few minutes, and I will turn this back over to Sarah.
Thank you, Michelle, for that presentation. It was pretty awesome and interesting. I just wanted, before we get to the questions, I wanted to give everyone an update on what our visitor center statuses are, respectively. So both of our visitor centers remain closed. However, we are both still doing outdoor interpretation and outdoor visitor assistance. We both have both vessel hotlines that you can call, which the numbers will be showing in a minute here, for our shipping schedules. And the Soo Locks was able to print off their inside exhibits and put them outside for everyone to enjoy. And our visitor center in Duluth has both a virtual tour and also a cell phone tour that you can use your cell phone to learn more about various places down here in Canal Park. And one more thing here. Okay, so I'm going to leave this up for a little bit. Michelle has her contact information there, as well as information where you can find the glass plate negatives from her program. And we can go through some of the questions now. If you're ready.
Sure.
So one of the questions was a comment about, so how am I doing this? All right, about how long it takes to build a lock. So it took 6 years to build the Sabin lock, and the new lock being built will take about 7 years. Just takes a long time to build a lock, no matter when it's built, correct?
Correct. And the Sabin lock was actually built fairly quickly. One of the things I neglected to say, I think, is an exact twin of the Davis lock. So it was the exact same plan, everything. And they had just finished building that lock. So all their lessons learned were still current events as they were building the Sabin lock. Everything they learned from the Davis, they were able to immediately apply to the Sabin. The MacArthur lock was like a whole other beast. That one was built in less than a year and a half. But as I had pointed out, it was 24-hour-a-day construction, 7 days a week. And that project came in more than double the original budget.
Okay. Another question, what kind of wood was used for the old lock floors, and how did they seal it?
That is a great question, and I wish I knew. I presume, I think, that's probably why they were bolted down, so they don't float up. And I honestly, I do not know. It's an awesome question, and I'll have to see if anybody can find any plans from those that might specify.
Okay, another question. Why are the Canadian locks shallow in comparison to the American?
The reason the lock is so shallow now is because it's a new lock built within an old lock chamber. the original lock chamber for that Canadian lock that was 899 feet long was 17 feet deep and, no, 18 feet deep. And that was basically the project depth of the river at the time that lock was built in 1895. So if the rest of the river is only dredged to that depth, there's no need to have a deeper lock, was probably the thinking. And of course, every foot you have to excavate is adding to your cost. And then when that lock failed and they built the new recreational lock there, they just used the same structure basically. So they weren't going to make it deeper, and they never intended for that new lock to be used for cargo vessels. It was just meant to be used for a smaller craft.
All right. I'm just going to show another screen that has a lot of our contact information from our various supporting organizations, as well as the USACE Detroit District's contact information. The Detroit District does have its own YouTube channel, and the recorded versions of these programs will be found on that channel, as well as all of our Facebook pages that you see at the top. The Soo Locks Vessel Hotline and the Twin Ports Vessel Hotline are both listed. They have updated information about shipping arrivals and departures, and the Twin Ports vessel schedule is located at harborlookout.com. We also have an email list that you can send an email to if you wanted to get added to our list, so you can learn more about the different programs that we have coming up. It's hellolsmvc@gmail.com. And also a quick survey. It takes about 3 to 5 minutes to take the survey. That will give us a little bit of feedback and help us to improve our programming. And as I mentioned before, next week, July 30th, next Thursday, we'll be having a program about the Duluth Ship Canal, 150 years of maritime transit. So Ranger Scott will be telling us about how the Duluth Ship Canal came to be, and the conflicts that resulted with Superior, and how it led to modern day Duluth Superior Harbor. So that will be next Thursday at 11:30 a.m. Central or 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And we'll just give everyone a couple more minutes if anyone thinks of any more questions